What's going on, world? It's yours truly, Mazi Mutafa, here for another episode of No New Leaders, my good brother, Dr. Jason Nichols. What up, Jay?
What's happening? How you doing?
I'm chilling. It's good to see you. And for a change, hopefully in the broadcast, I'm the one that's all crispy, and you the one that's all pixelated.
Doesn't look like it right now. I think I'm the crispy clear one, and you're the pixelated persons. Yet again.
You just had to burst my bubble. All right. Well, what's most important is that we're both here and that we're going to have a conversation today that's really inspired by that video clip I just shared, which was the 2017 Words Beats and Life Festival. It was the inaugural festival, and it was amazing. We did all this stuff. And we're gearing up right now for the 7th annual Words Beats and Life Festival. This year, really focused more on jazz and poetry from a hip-hop perspective. And along those lines, one of the things we've done is create a new publication called the Rap Laureate. And to that end, you and Mikal Lee were both invited to review the catalog of the inaugural Rap Laureate, which is Lupe Fiasco, for which you wrote an essay called The Last Samurai, which personally, Jay, I thought was one of your most inspired pieces of writing. I was really struck. Like, it was compelling. I was like, what's next? And so I wanted to talk to you about it because I felt it was still relevant even though it's an article about Lupe, I thought it was the way you talked about the principles, the guiding principles of the samurai. It felt like they applied today. So today's topic is officially ancient wisdom in modern times. And so thinking about the things that we have to learn from the past, because normally our conversations about the past don't go past the civil rights movement or its early stages. But this I thought was really, again, an inspired piece of writing that Lupe threw you to alley oop because he's so focused on martial arts. But maybe before we get into the samurai, because I know you're not an expert on samurai, but I do know that you are a practitioner of Krav Maga, which is an Israeli martial arts form. And so maybe talking about the ways in which martial arts, training your body, training your mind, then potentially apply to leadership.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting that we're talking about martial arts and kind of knowledge production. I think, Lupe, as I was kind of going through his lyrics and, doing a little background research on him and knowing that he is a believer in Bushido and kind of that samurai code of honor that they have. And he's trying to, in his music, I think trying to deal with that and these principles that he kind of grew up with and was groomed with, also with the society that he lives in, which is very different than the men who started Bushido and started, lived the samurai life, because we live in a capitalist society that deals with consumption and ostentatious presentation. And I think one of the really cool things about Lupe's music is you can see kind of him trying to, you know, uh, I don't want to say marry the two, but certainly trying to navigate between, his beliefs and his reality, which I think is a struggle that most of us can relate to. Krav Maga as a martial art is really interesting. It's kind of like a new wave of martial arts. Um, I think of Krav Maga, which again, as you said, is Israeli, and Israel's only about 70 years old. 1948. Of course, the art started a little earlier than that because it started during the Holocaust. Emi Lichtenfeld, he was somebody who I believe he's in Poland or Hungary or Belarus, somewhere in Eastern Europe, that as a Jew was watching Jews be beaten, mercilessly by the Nazis, and seeing them lose street fights really like hurt him. He was affected by that. Um, and so he knew he was a champion wrestler. That was kind of his original martial art. And we know wrestling is one of the martial arts that goes back, you know, to biblical times. With Jacob wrestling, angels. It goes all the way back. With his experience, he wanted to train and teach Jews how to deal with combat. And they were a small group, and so as a small group and throughout Europe, not even just in Eastern Europe, Jews have been bullied. So he was like, even on an individual level, whether it's individual or whether it's you know military combat, we need to learn it all. We need to learn how to defend against weapons. We need to learn how to fight with weapons. We need to learn how to win a street fight. Because that's the kind of thing that Jews were dealing with as he was growing up. I believe he's from Belarus, but I could be, mixing up my Eastern European states, given that Eastern Europe has been in the news a lot recently. And so a lot of what I like about Krav Maga, and I know some people are going to have issues with it because it's Israeli, but I like the mentality of it. The mentality of Krav Maga is, fight until you win, never give up. And, sometimes there's, some questionable elements, I think, in terms of the mentality of, always being aware of threats. Um, And I think that, some people could argue, of course, always seeing threats is not always a good thing. I think, situational awareness, though, is a good thing, always recognizing, your surroundings. If you need to leave, you don't always need to fight. Sometimes you can leave, and having that kind of situational awareness. But the overall point that I'm making is that with newer martial arts, including, things like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Krav Maga, they take on elements of the society that they're born in. And there were certain things that Bushido and the samurai code, you know, you can see things that values that were revered out of the Japanese culture at the time, modesty and, um, being honorable, being honest. Those were things that, were seen as kind of the highest art in Japanese culture at the time. I think it's a little bit different when we're talking about, you know, society today when we're looking at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or what now we call mixed martial arts or Krav Maga. They also take on some of the societal elements that we have in our culture. Um, and so I think that there's always knowledge being produced through martial arts.
Jay, I wonder, with that being said, I wonder a couple of things. One, what in preparing to write this essay, what was the process? What was the research you needed to do on Lupe himself? But then also, what kind of research did you do on the history and principles of samurai?
So, I mean, it started out, I don't think I even knew that I was going to write about like his connection to, samurai ethics and all of that. And I would tell anybody who's watching this, go back and look at our episode where we interviewed uh, Adisa Banjoko as well, who talked a little bit about stoicism and how that affected his martial arts, practice and all of that. I just started reading up on his background, reading his interviews in like, Vibe magazine or All Hip Hop or wherever he was being interviewed on the internet that I could find. Reading his Wikipedia page, reading all that kind of stuff, trying to find links that I could, find out more information about him. Cause I knew his music, a little bit. I knew his biggest songs and his biggest records.
Don't forget you also didn't like him because of his fans. Don't forget that part.
Yeah, I mean, I thought he was always an incredibly skilled rapper, and I love the fact that he was different too. Like he rapped about things that were a little bit different in themes, and he was, doing the whole skateboard thing before skateboarding was cool in hip hop. To be this kind of alternative hip hop guy. He was the first guy to really usher that in. Like, I am myself. I am different. I'm not, hang outside the bodega, rapper that you're used to. I like to skateboard, and I thought that was always cool. I thought his fans were a little pretentious at times. That is true. Like as if they were smarter than other hip hop fans. But I've always been a fan of Lupe.
But Jay, before you move, because let's deal with that, because in reading your essay, one of the things that you say,
using my words against me.
Yeah, but they're not against you, because they're affirming an idea different than what you just said, which is that clearly he's a person that reads a lot, that he's informed about the things that he's rapping about, that to the point where his listeners need to go read or research some of the things he's talking about, because they're not necessarily like what's on the news or what's in your regular K through 12 classroom or even necessarily your university classroom. So wouldn't by extension on some levels, his fans need to be smarter in order to know what he's actually talking about? This is a real question.
So I think there's a difference between being smarter and more informed.
Okay.
I think there are people out there who I think are more informed than I am on a lot of subjects, but are really not smarter. I think those are two different things. But I also would say that a lot of them probably view Lupe as a credible source. So they don't necessarily read more on the subject. They say, oh man, Lupe's a smart rapper and he's making me aware of this. And therefore, because you listen to Young Jeezy, I'm just using somebody, randomly, you know, you listen to, Young Thug, you somehow are not as informed as I am because I uh listen to Lupe. And I kind of reject that. I think, I've met people who listen to Young Thug who are really, really informed about a lot of subjects. And they don't take Young Thug or Lupe to be the source. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they are better informed. I also think that there's a class element to that. I think a lot of the people, even the young people who listen to Lupe, are of a different class than people who listen to, Young Thug, probably, and at least within certain communities. And I just don't like the idea of assuming because you listen to this rapper that somehow you know something somebody else doesn't.
I got you. So let's talk about that process of doing the research on the samurai, and particularly the things that you learned that you can remember. I know it's been a while since you wrote the article.
Mhm.
We're just getting around to publishing. It's going to be released at this year's Remixing the Art of Social Change conference, happening at the Martin Luther King Library on Saturday, April the 8th. I'm personally really excited because we just started promoting the festival, and right now, Remixing the Art of Social Change has the most people who've secured tickets, and I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to fill up the library and be able to give away 280 copies of this first issue of the new publication, Rap Laureate, to all the folks in attendance. So I'm giving you all that runway to be able to remember what are all the things I learned about the samurai. So some of them you wrote about, but what are the things that you can remember that you learned, maybe that were surprising to you or affirming, but that you could because I think the thing that's interesting is not just that you learned about the samurai, but that you could make direct correlations between his practices as an artist, and the set of principles that their orders are founded on. Tell me what you learned.
When I think most about it, like I said, I think a big thing was modesty. And when I think of, the samurai and, honor and honesty, and, one of the things that always that really struck me was if you were not honorable or honest, um, that some samurais felt that it was best that you kill yourself. You know what I mean? Like, so how in hip hop slang people say kill yourself. Like, if you are not honorable, there are samurais who would take their own lives. I don't think that relates to Lupe per se. Um, but that's how seriously they took their principles. When we're talking about the Bushido era of samurai practice, like it was really about being humble and honest and a lot of the things that I think our society talks about, or at least our grandfathers used to tell us about being a man. Um, when we were all growing up. I think that some of what we think manhood is about now has shifted. But that was, it was kind of that same kind of code that the samurai took very seriously. Protecting the vulnerable, and I think that's what Lupe endeavors to do with his music is to expose things he thinks are injustice and protect people that he thinks are vulnerable, and he thinks that that's part of his duty and honor, as a samurai or a modern day samurai.
I'm curious. Do you think that that Lupe, if he was on this the show with us, do you think he would describe himself as a leader or as an example or as just a practitioner? How do you think he would see himself based on the things that you gleaned from listening to his catalog?
Honestly, I think it would depend on the day we caught him. I think some days, you know, he would be in line with Bushido and say, and be humble, and I think he might think that, saying he's a leader is, you know, a little bit too conceited. Um, he also may not want, I'm thinking about some of the things that he said about, his spiritual beliefs, that he may not want that responsibility either. It's a lot of responsibility to be a leader. And particularly if you're thinking about yourself as a leader for your listeners and you've got, 2 billion streams or whatever, however many that he has. So I think he wouldn't, on some days he wouldn't say he's a leader. But I think if you questioned his leadership, I think the MC side of him would come out, and I think he would tell you that he's everything that MCs tell their fans that they are. Um, and I think some of that humility would go away, which I think on some level comes from we could argue and follow me here. We could argue that comes from at least the Black or African American practice of martial arts. The main martial art that African Americans have excelled at has been boxing. And part of boxing, at least post Muhammad Ali, has been to brag about who you are and what you do and how great you are. It's not about that Bushido style humility. It actually is. And I would say, again, Muhammad Ali did that because he came out of Lexington, Kentucky, or excuse me, Louisville. He came out of Louisville, Kentucky, and came out of the segregated South, where people told people like Muhammad Ali, you are less than, And so Muhammad Ali, in his rejection of that status, that second class status that the United States has put Black people in, he said, no, I'm incredible. I'm beautiful. I'm pretty. I'm fast. I'm handsome. He was somebody who made, and that got connected with the martial art itself, even if it lost some of the social message. So you hear guys like Floyd Mayweather and other people who have gone out and said, I'm the greatest. I'm so good. I can't be stopped. And obviously Muhammad Ali, I would argue, with his poetry, was an influence on hip hop. You think about the early hip hop fans, early hip hop practitioners, they were coming out of the generation where they watched Muhammad Ali, and Muhammad Ali was the greatest. And our generation of hip hop came out of Mike Tyson, where he's like, my defense is impregnable. I'm, I'm the most ferocious, champion ever.
I am your retribution. Oh, sorry, that wasn't Tyson. My
bad. Yeah. That guy probably was friends with Tyson, but
he was. But hey, let me ask a question, because I wonder, the other thing that comes, there's a few things that come through in your essay, which are his influences. You briefly talk about the influence of Islam on his music, and you talk about what you would imagine would be a socialist impact from his father on his music and his worldview. I wonder, do you think that the combination of interest in samurai traditions, Islam, and socialism is in many ways a uniquely African American experience, in that more so than other groups in the United States, there is a desire to learn, to build, to create, to, on some levels, to create an identity, or to recreate an identity. But do you think that the fact that not just that he's an MC from Chicago and he had the life that he lived, but the fact that he is an African American made him open to these other traditions that he might not otherwise have been? Do you understand the question?
Um,
It's like you as a black Muslim American practices an Israeli martial arts.
mhm.
Like you're open to traditions that are not your own, but you're willing to make them your own because you see value in it. And I
Yeah.
think that in a lot of instances, people take on traditions because they are their family's tradition or their people's tradition, not necessarily because they see value in it. So on some levels, I'm asking, do you think, what role does the fact that he's an African American play in his level of openness to these to embodying these particular traditions?
Oh, I think it's a huge factor in that. When we look at his life and his upbringing, you know, the fact that his father was a Panther, um, and you know, even going beyond that, African Americans, so many of our ethnic traditions, we are hybridized people. You know, we are so many cultures in Africa all combined into one. So while that has advantages, when we came here, we were also stripped of any one identifiable culture, you know, ancient culture, you know. Um, so while you know a Chinese person can point back to Chinese culture from you know antiquity, an African American can't do that. So an African American is literally seeking knowledge production or seeking, you know, what they can take and use and redefine and put into their own context. And so I think we do that, you know, with the most beautiful element of that, I think for our culture that I always reference is names. You know, we don't know our traditional African names. Um, and even if we did, we are a mixture of so many different African cultures that we really don't have one. So what we did, we started making up our own names, you know, and they had a little bit of African basis, you know, with Keisha, and then we put Lakeisha, Takesha, you know, Tanisha, you know, we started, you know, kind of mixing it up. Laquante, Demonte, you know, and mainstream culture is always trying to tell us to be ashamed of that. I think one of the things that Lupe and others did was, you know, in their his parents in trying to find something that represented freedom. So that's how you could get into socialism. You know, represented a code of ethics. We didn't have our African, you know, code of ethics that came from antiquity. So he's reading and looking for what's available. We don't even have that available in a lot of books, but you can find out about martial arts. You can read about ancient China. You can read about ancient Europe. You can read about those things. So, you know, him being introduced to all of that, I think, and putting it together to make what Lupe is, I think is part of the African American tradition. We're constantly looking for our identity. I remember hearing a scholar talk about being an African American is the same sensation as being an adopted child. Like you have a home, you know, you have parents, but you're constantly wondering about your identity. You're constantly grabbing at whatever straws of your identity that you can find. You know, it might be, you know, the sensation of being part of a transracial adoption where yeah, you have a home and you actually love the home. Um Problematic as it may be, but you're always trying to find something to call your own and to call your own culture, or even if you can't find it, trying to take whatever you can, whatever knowledge you can, and shape it into your culture. And
I
I
think
think that's what Lupe was doing.
I think the only thing I would push back on is the use of the word always. I think that definitely at a young age, I can personally identify with those remarks. But I definitely know, having now traveled around the world, and met people on the continent and in Asia and in the Caribbean and South America, like that there is something uniquely American about the community that we're a part of,
Mhm.
and about the culture that we're working to build. I mean, I think like African Americans don't have an ancient culture in this country, unless you believe our friends who and I think rightly so, believe our friends who believe that many Africans came to the continent before the European explorers. I think that that's, the more I thought about it when I first got introduced to that idea, because it kind of speaks to what you're talking about, this
Mhm.
ever searching for an identity, that this idea that to me, where they go too far is to say everybody who is here now was already here, as opposed to no, there were people here before Africans were brought here in slave ships. Um, but I think even that kind of speaks to this desire on the part of people to have an identity that is beyond the 400-year history, like like that longing that you're talking about is, to me, is spoken to in those folks that say I'm not my ancestors, as if that's supposed to be a diss against our ancestors, when it's really like, you're right, they were more resilient, they fought harder, they worked harder, they actually were subjected to worse conditions. You are not them. And while you think that's a slight against them, it really is about assessing what it is that you've done and how it is that you've worked to change the material conditions of our community and yourself. But with that being said, I wonder,
And
thinking, what you about
no,
to?
the only thing I was gonna say is those same people who say I'm not my ancestors, you can catch these hands. Those are the same people who said hands up, don't shoot. So which is it? You know what I mean? Like a lot of these people, Anyway, we can go on.
I mean, it's sloganeering for T-shirts. I get it. Like, it's not truly an indictment, but it is. But I think on some levels, it's really disrespectful. It's
I do.
disrespectful.
I agree.
Is disrespectful to what it is. Like Ida B. Wells started a newspaper because almost every day in this country, a person, whether a child, a woman, or a man, was lynched, and she put out a flag every day that said today a man was lynched, or today someone was lynched. We
Mhm.
don't live in that America.
We don't.
Um, but if we did, I don't know. It would be interesting to see what the response, like how people would respond to living in that America. What protests would look like, what kind of reimagining of this, that, and the third would look like. But that's another conversation. I want to ask you. Let's suppose that today is a day that Lupe is thinking about himself as a leader. You're assessing him. What are the kind of leadership traits that you see not only in his music, in his interviews, in his artwork, in his videos? How do you think leadership really shows up in his life, in his work, in his creativity?
So I think one of the things that is really dope about Lupe, as if you want to imagine him as a leader, is his boldness. He was willing to say things that, remember everybody else in 2008 through 2010, uh, maybe even later within our communities, were talking about Obama as hope and change. And here's Lupe saying, "You're a war criminal." I mean, like that's pretty bold. We were all rocking with, or not we were all, but many of us were rocking with Obama. We were like, Obama, first black president, blah, blah, blah. We're really excited about this. We're excited. He's kind of young, he's hip, he listens to hip hop, you know, he's our guy. And, when news was coming out about what was going on in, Syria and Libya and, places all over the Middle East,
Palestine.
he was talking about, look, Obama, you're out there droning kids. That's a war crime. I don't care what ethnicity you come from, what community you claim, how I'm supposed to be proud. Just because I'm supposed to be proud doesn't mean I have to, shill for you when what you're doing is wrong. And so I think one of the big elements of leadership is boldness and again honesty. And I think he represented that. And again, Obama's complicated. I'm not trying to bash Obama at all. Um, but I think it took an amount of bravery, particularly when hip hop was something that boosted Obama. And rappers around the world were talking about my president's black. And the community had circled the wagons around Obama. And you have somebody, I mean, most leaders usually come with a message that is outside of the mainstream. At least that's the way it starts. Or many, leaders. And he was somebody who was speaking to young black and brown people and left-leaning people and saying, this guy is doing something that's harming children. And I think that, you can definitely talk about the bravery in that statement. If you believe that cancel culture is real, which I have my doubts, you could say, he could have gotten canceled for that.
There's a quote that you have from him that says, "Life is complicated, from my understanding." So I think in certain capacities, when you listen to Lupe Fiasco music, you get a reflection of the complexity of the situation that we find ourselves in. I don't just put "fuck the police" and that's it. It's like, why are we fucking the police? Is it even cool to say "fuck the police"? What does that have to do? Sorry, what does that do with the police? What are we going to do if we don't have police? Let's break it down and get into the nuts and the bolts. I think that when we find the solution, if you're willing, I think we can find the solution if you're willing to do the work. So even with that critique of maybe F Obama, he's saying, but what we supposed like that same idea could be applied to his own critiques. Like, okay, be critical of the president, but what is our responsibility to hold power to account? Is it just to be critical of it? Is it to think about what ways in which to work with power, what ways to challenge power, and if you're removing power, what do you replace it with? So being able to ask, like, to be a critic, but then to be reflective and say it's not enough to just criticize, that you have to be willing to build something better. And to me, that would be an example of leadership, not in the hierarchical sense, but in the challenging people to do more than just use their words. They have to actually use their minds and use their hands and their bodies to do something about the thing that they're talking about.
Yeah, no, I hear that 100%. I think he's he is calling for critical thinking. He's not making it simple and easy and sloganeering. I think he's pretty specific about his issue with Obama. And I don't think he's necessarily saying, at least that I recall, like he's saying, I hate Obama, Obama's the worst. He's saying, Obama, you've committed war crimes. That makes you a war criminal. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm not saying that I'm not agreeing or disagreeing or anything like that. I think, the droning of kids under his leadership is pretty well established. I think we've done some things that have been pretty bad under every administration in the United States. And I think he's saying that I think in a way it's kind of a call out of Obama because he believes Obama has more of a conscience than some of the others who have committed these kinds of crimes. I could be wrong about all of that.
But to that point, it's also a matter of saying, even asking the question, what American, considering all of the violence that America has been involved in its entire history, how come no American president has ever been accused of a war crime? How, like, this idea of America being accountable either to the world or to its citizens. For us, that accountability looks like democracy in terms of voting people in and out. But in other places, it looks like, American choppers coming in to pick you up to bring you to an American prison. It looks like, ousting you from power under the guise of a popular revolution. And so asking, I think ultimately, like for me at least, one of the other things I take from your essay is that in a lot of ways morality is not situational. Life is complex, but even in that complexity, there is still right and there is still wrong. And in this example, the use of drones is wrong because of what the impact is. Now, the situational piece of that is, how would Lupe feel if instead of sending in drones, um, the U.S. government sent in troops, and those troops ideally had less civilians that were murdered, but then those Americans also put their lives at risk. So it's like this idea of which situation is really more just, the one where if you are going to take a life, you risk your life, or the one where um, you, under the guise of national security and protection, protect your own citizens, but try to take out the quote unquote bad guys. Like that's a conversation. Like we never have that conversation as Americans, other than the idea of saying that we would prefer drones so that fewer troops have to die in conflicts, right?
Mhm.
Because America loves its troops, and it should, because its troops are its citizens. Um, but that doesn't mean that there are no, like, even the idea that we call those children or those women or those men who were murdered that weren't the people that were the target. We call them collateral damage. We don't actually call them human beings. We don't call them mothers and fathers or someone's child. Like this whole idea of dehumanizing people, and what he's doing in that particular song, something things I never said, is saying what he didn't say when those things were happening, and sharing his own regret for not using his platform to speak out against injustice, and allowing the complexity to silence his voice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Um,
That
I
feels like a
think
leadership principle, just as a side note. It feels like, you know, being holding yourself accountable feels like one of the things that we should expect from leaders. Not just they have to be like they have to hold themselves accountable and be accountable to their followers or their partners, etc.
I'm the only thing that I would say is that I'm not so sure Lupe endeavors to be a leader in the sense of a call to direct action. I mean, he's an artist, and a lot of our artists um, don't necessarily, they want to get a message out. Like even if you talk about James Brown with "I'm Black and I'm Proud," important message, or Sam Cooke, "Change Gonna Come." Those are important messages, but they're not direct calls to action. They may motivate people, and they're something that gets people hyped up, but it's not like this is what we need to do. And this is where I think you and I, we kind of agree to disagree about leadership. And I think you would say it's management, I would say it's leadership. If you're going to tell people, all right, look, this is our strategy, this is what we're going to do, this is how this is going to work, this is how we're going to attack a particular problem. And I don't necessarily, I think Lupe's music is more introspective than that, um, than just like a direct call to action.
Right. I don't really know that I'm disagreeing. I think that because this show is about leadership, because one of the things that having these conversations, we're now on our 28th conversation about leadership, and what's crazy is we've talked more about leadership in these 21 episodes than we have in the last 21 years of knowing each other.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things I've come to accept is that every leader doesn't have that title. Every leader doesn't think about themselves that way. But the ways in which other people, like, it almost feels like, the like, I talk about management versus leadership, but I feel like one of the things that I've learned is that really great managers really are leaders. Like people don't just stay there. Don't just always. Many people don't stay at jobs just because they've got a consistent check. They really do stay to work with the people that are doing that work, and they feel like they can contribute. Oftentimes under the leadership or vision or guidance, management of the higher ups. But I also think about, like, for myself, thinking about the people that are community-based leaders who no one pays them to do what it is that they do. They really just do it because they really believe in it. And those are the people that I hold up as leaders, as people who they ain't got to pay nobody. If they call a rally, they call a meeting, people are showing up. Like, and I feel like for me at least, this is rooted in. Um, I know that if I couldn't pay people for a month, everybody who works at Worthy's Life will go away, regardless of what they think about me as a manager or a leader or whatever. So I understand there's a transactional nature to my own role, and so I call that management. You on many occasions have said, no, Mazi, that's leadership. You just have the ability to blah, blah, blah. But when I think about Lupe, right, are people checking for him that are not like people pay him for his guidance in terms of the music, in terms of the interviews, in terms of, or if they're not paying money, they're paying attention. That if he's on the Breakfast Club, if he's so like this idea of influence, because I feel like the more I've talked to you about this, I'm coming closer to your own arguments. So it'll be interesting to see if we end up trading sides, where I'm like, no, those influencers really are leaders, and no, those musicians, they really are leaders because people listen to them and follow them. Those people, those pretentious fans that you were talking about, are more informed, are guided by his own research, his own knowledge, and I think that there is something there. Like I do think that much of my understanding is rooted too deeply in religion and this idea that the people who you don't pay to follow you are the ones that elect you leader. The people that actually pay you for your guidance are the ones that decide that you are a leader. Thinking about tithing or thinking about um, um, the other ways in which religious leaders collect money from the people who follow them. And I
What
think
about political donations?
I think that like we had that one show where we talked about political leaders, and one of the pushbacks from the viewers was those people are not leaders; they are our servants. Which
It's
I
servant
get,
leadership. Go ahead. Sorry.
but they meant that in the sense that those are people that work for us. We don't follow them; we tell them what to do. Um, and I think that's different than servant leadership. Um, even right now, like a lot of the well, we're getting off topic, but the point is, I think that I am beginning to accept a broader definition of who is a leader. And I would say, based on the audience, based on the popularity, based on the content, this idea, like I would say Kendrick is a leader, bro. Like I know we're talking about Lupe, but Kendrick talking about therapy, talking about breaking generational curses, making room for other people to explore and to discuss. And in that way, Lupe is doing the same thing by rapping about dinosaurs and rapping about, the people at the bottom of the sea and like all these things that nobody else is talking about. He brings into the conversation so that he's not a piggybacker. He's a driver of conversation. And you could say not everybody's following what he's driving, but the people that are. Like a leader doesn't mean everybody got to follow you. It just means there are people that do.
Yeah, I think if you want to accept the idea of a thought leader, then I think Lupe is a thought leader. Kendrick is a thought leader. Um, a lot of times when I think of leadership, just kind of colloquially, I think about someone who is calling people to a particular action. And the whole time we were talking, or the whole time you were talking, I was kind of thinking about Donald Trump. Um, because he's somebody who certainly profits. So when you were like, someone who's paid to be there, I'm like, but he still is a leader. Number one, he can call things, call direct action from his followers. They will literally follow his direct lead. We saw that on January 6th. We've seen that if he gets indicted, I think you're going to see it again.
Yo, let's not drift. Let's not drift because this show is about ancient wisdom in modern times. I know I initiated that drift by bringing up other people. So I just want to say, let's bring it back
Okay.
because along those same lines, you talked about Lupe's influence on promoting skating culture.
Hmm.
He wasn't the first. Like you really could point to Skateboard P as one of the first people to really bring skateboarding into Pharrell into the kind of hip hop lexicon. Um, but I would say that
I mean, Wayne.
Wayne
Wayne
is
got.
after that though. Wayne is after that. Wayne is after Lupe.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of talking about skateboarding,
Yeah. Yeah.
but even this idea of um, doing rapping about things that are not necessarily black, like or black experience, a common black experience, rapping about black history, doing his own kind of speculative fiction about history. Like, what if none of these things had ever happened? Like, who's writing those? Who's writing those bars? And I feel like the answer is only Lupe. And in that sense, he is a writer unto himself, a leader unto himself, but also an inspiration and a motivator for people who haven't lived, you know, what is on 90% of the playlists under the hip hop category on Spotify or Apple Music or what have you. But he's been a witness to some of that. He has friends who've done some of that, but he's also done things like like make it plain that he's not going to dumb down his lyrics. Did a song called "Dumb It Down" where the voice is telling him, "Yo, make a song for the chickens, nigga," and he's like, "No, I'm not going to do that." Be clear, I'm being intentional about not necessarily asking you to come up, but not bringing myself to not bringing myself down to talk about baser things. Like I feel like on a lot of levels, um, Lupe is one of hip hop's philosophers, for real, for real. And I think it's more than thought leader because he's actually asking us to imagine things that no one like. He's not bound by what is. He's bound by what could be, and what could be is a lot of things. Like there's so many things that could be, and I feel like that's a different space for a black man in popular media to be occupying. It's powerful.
I agree. I think black people have always been talking about what could be. Um, I think based on our situation, I think that's. I might even argue that a large percentage of black music has been about what could be. Um, Going back, certainly, civil rights and post civil rights. The whole idea is, what could be and what it would take to get there. Um, and so I think that there's been a lot of music.
That's a stretch. That's a stretch because I love it. We finally found something for us to debate about in this conversation.
Okay.
It's a stretch because, of course, literally, you are correct. Um, Making music about equality or equity is imaginative in a segregated, racist country. Yes, but that's not dinosaurs. That's not W.B. Du Bois wrote the Constitution. That's not Bill O'Reilly read from the Quran at X, Y, and Z's funeral. Like that's a really like the only space where I think that you are correct about what you're saying is Afrofuturism as a form of speculative fiction. But I don't think that just imagining that you know something could be different is is the same as what I'm talking about, which is using the examples of his actual music to point to like the idea that the ocean life is his homeboys. Why? Because so many of us either were thrown over or jumped overboard on the way over. That our ancestors literally their DNA or their bones or their remains or what's left of their remains is literally a part of ocean life. And so really like having a conversation about no one in popular culture is talking about or thinking about or writing about or performing about those things. And so the only reason why I do that, it's a stretch, is because of course you're right that as a community that has been the subject of centuries of oppression, we've always aspired for more. But that's not the same as what I'm talking about. You are literally correct that it's a part of music and culture, but not in the same way that, at least that I'm describing.
No, I hear that. No, I can accept that as well. That I won't say that he's the only one who's tapping into ideas that other people aren't. And I certainly, if you want to call Kendrick a leader and talk about it, because he's talking about therapy, I think there are rappers who've been talking about therapy or going to therapy, before Kendrick, and they're certainly talking about it now and trying to normalize it. I just think that he's got a bigger megaphone. But yeah, no, I see where you're coming from with that, and I know you were looking for a big disagreement, but I don't think we're necessarily in disagreement about that.
Now, I just wanted a reason to be like, stretch. I wanted to do like, well, as we get ready to wrap up, I think one of the other things that you point to is the fact that Kendrick, like a lot of MCs over the course of the last couple of decades in particular, is always talking about retiring and not making music anymore. I feel like he said, like, the last time he said he was retiring was like 4 albums ago. But what do you think that's about from the, like, again, through a leadership lens, this idea of I've said all the things I have to say, when it's clear he has so many things to say about so many different things, and especially if the role is to be as a musician, to be for him is to be a thought leader. Why does he talk about retiring? Why does he talk about going away? I can understand, like with the Jay-Z example or Too Short or name any other artist, but why in Kendrick's case in particular do you think that it feels more? You describe it, the
We're talking about Lupe,
is,
right?
yeah, Lupe's retirement feels more real, except for the fact that he has so much to talk about. Why do you think he even brings that up when he describes his motivation? There's gonna forever be things that would motivate him to talk about his own perspective. Why would he talk about
That's a tough question. I think, I think one of the frustrations for a lot of artists, even if you have a lot more to say, is, are people listening? And are they listening the way you want them to listen? And then, I know a frustration even of mine when I was making music was, are the people who I want to be listening? And so I think that he's probably dealing with all of that. I don't think he's running out of ideas or things to talk about. He's a creative person. He's always, his mind, I'm sure, is always working. You don't make the kind of music that he made without having a mind that's always running and always working and always analyzing things. And he could make 10 albums about one subject and find different ways to talk about it every single time, because I think he's the type of person whose thinking evolves as well, as times evolve and as circumstances change. But at the same time, I think for a lot of artists, it does get frustrating when you're like, are people listening? Are they hearing me? You know what I mean? They, like, if you remember White Men Can't Jump, when they said, yeah, you can hear Jimmy, but or you're listening to Jimmy, but you can't hear him.
Method Man got a line that says, "You might hear me, but you don't listen."
Or either way, one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's part of it. Is he being digested the way he wants by the people he wants it to be digested by? And I think for a lot of artists in Lupe's kind of realm, that's a constant frustration.
It's as we get ready to wrap, I think it's interesting because I feel like, particularly for Black artists who want to be embraced by Black audiences, this is a kind of perpetual question. Like, the Roots played, or they included a snippet from Spike Lee's, what was the movie about the jazz musicians?
Bamboozle?
No. Oh. With Wesley Snipes.
Mo Better Blues.
Mo Better Blues. So they had that clip where Denzel is talking about, if we had to depend on our people to eat, we would starve, brother. And then
oh yeah, it's like they make something they like.
Right. He said,
Yeah.
"You grandiose mofo's just want to be da da da," and so it feels like on some levels, it's weird though because Lupe has had like making things I never said was probably one of his biggest hits. I saw him on MTV Live at Spring Break singing that song to a bunch of kids in bikinis. It was kind of weird to like hear him being critical of Obama and talking about wars as his biggest single. I feel like that was the last time he was on radio too, heavy, was for Things I Never Said.
But he's
And
doing it on MTV for an audience that maybe he doesn't necessarily identify with.
no, I got you. But I'm saying that he had the megaphone. He had the
Yeah.
biggest megaphone in the world, putting out what could be arguably one of his most controversial songs, and it was heard by maybe audiences he wasn't right. He didn't necessarily want to be his core audience. But I think even with that said, the question becomes, knowing that he's borrowed from so many traditions, why wouldn't he also want his audience to be as diverse as his influences? Why wouldn't he want those kids on spring break to get a political education, or at least the beginnings of one, while they're on break? We'll never know. What we do know is that your essay is by far one of the best things I've read in 2023. I'm looking forward to publishing this book and getting you a copy, and getting 280 people copies at Remixing the Art of Social Change, happening on Saturday, April the 8th at the Martin Luther King Library. This is one of 5 panels or activities happening over the course of the day. It's going to be you, Macau, and Prowess the Testament talking about your appreciation for Lupe, and the process of writing this book. Jay, I want to thank you for joining me once again for No New Leaders, exploring ancient wisdom in modern times. Thanks, bro.
Thank you.
I would be cutting you off in the middle of you saying what?
I said thank you as always, my brother.
Peace. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is your 28th episode of No New Leaders, Ancient Wisdom in Modern Times. We spent this time talking about Lupe Fiasco and a book that we're publishing called Rap Laureates, where Dr. Jason Nichols is one of the authors. If you missed the beginning, here's what the Words Beats and Life Festival looks like. This is going down April the 4th through April the 9th here in DC and Maryland. Peace, y'all.
They deflate the game. I'm just throwing bullets like